And I understand there's a process. Ben Johnson has more football knowledge in his pinky than I will ever have in my entire life. But I just have to question, why is that best for the process? Why is sitting on the sidelines and not playing in a preseason game best for the process for a second-year quarterback that has a new head coach and a new offensive system? Because I would be shocked if Caleb Williams played the third preseason game. I mean, no starters in the NFL play in that third preseason game. So now Caleb Williams is only getting, I mean, I doubt he's going to play all 4 quarters of the second preseason game. So what, he gets a handful of series, maybe a half of preseason work before we actually see live snaps in the regular season? Like, I don't know why that process is the best one. I guess my question is, I'm not doubting that it is. We'll see. I just wonder why that's the process when we see Joe Burrow and Bryce Young and Patrick Mahomes play in the first game in the preseason.
I think it's probably a fair question by you. Well, it is a fair question by you. And I think, just speculation, my answer would be, did they have a certain number of reps they wanted to get time on task before they put it out in front of everybody? Or were there other players that created variables? If your starting quarterback is playing, then your starting offensive line needs to play. And you don't want to put your quarterback at risk. So I think there's probably some of those conditions, but I think the bigger part of this is you just have to know the noise. And that's one thing that I understand players and coaches and clubs tell you, that they shut it out. When you have an honest conversation, I've been lucky enough in my career to have a few of them with players. Most of them will tell you, you try your best to shut out the noise, but you still hear some of it. You got to know the noise you're creating when Caleb doesn't play, especially when so much of the footage from practice is frankly looked terrifying. Like Caleb Williams, the nuggets that have made it out on camera from practice have not just looked bad, they've looked god-awful. So now, when you combine that with the only information we have, which is he's not playing in the first preseason game, of course we're all looking at it and saying, well, is there a problem? You don't want to trot him out there? And that was the crux of the conversation I saw earlier this week from some experts that were sitting there saying, if he doesn't play at all in the preseason, does that mean he's not ready? Those are the questions that are going to be created, and they're fair questions. The hardest part about this, I keep going back to, is we saw in quarterback, we saw Goff talk about Ben Johnson and guys being on the same page and the language and all of these things. And then we've heard Ben Johnson say clearly that this is a rebuild all the way from the studs with Caleb. Well, if that's the case, I do think it's fair to look at it and say, has there been enough time on task in practices, in meetings, in preseason, and all of those things? Because there won't be grace offered in week 1 if this doesn't look right. Like there's a level of expectation when you are the highest touted coaching hire of the cycle and you are a number 1 overall pick from the draft just a year ago. There are going to be immediate expectations that this offense looks competent. So right now, I think everybody's buckling up for this weekend, because if it looks tragically bad or wildly safe, I don't know how patient everybody's going to feel about analyzing the Bears.
And you don't really have much of a ramping up period in the regular season. You start with the Vikings, you go to Detroit, then you get the Cowboys. No offense, Fitz. Then you got a little bit of a reprieve when you go to the Raiders. Then you have a bye week.
The strays I'm catching on. You know what?
That Raiders the truth
is bad.
It's just the truth.
Is bad. Raiders going to beat the Bears, though.
You heard it here first, folks.
Go ahead.
Put some money on the hardwood. But the first 4 weeks of the season, I mean, that's a grind. And there's something that you just said right there that I have to nitpick. There's been a lot of speculation. If Caleb Williams doesn't play in the preseason, does that mean he's not ready? Tell me how that makes sense. Tell me how Ben Johnson, a brilliant offensive mind, could look at his quarterback and say, you know what? He's not ready, so he's going to get less reps, and he's going to get fewer looks, and we're not going to give him the opportunity to get live game looks. Like, how does that make sense other than we are trying to protect Caleb Williams from the court of public opinion and the criticism that would inevitably come if he plays in a preseason game and stinks it up?
That right there is the tin hat.
What is that? Like, how does that make sense?
I'm an
Get off Twitter. Like, who cares?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist. You know that. Like, I'll say loudly, I don't care if we never walked on the moon. Doesn't change my Thursday. Like, I don't care about any of that. But the logic I've heard presented on their protecting Caleb is it looks so bad in practice and he doesn't really have a grasp of the offense and they don't want to put him out there where everybody's going to be asking questions and it's not going to look good. That's the
This is
conspiracy.
the NFL. This is the NFL. And if you can't handle it, you can't be in it. And I think there's been questions about Caleb Williams' ability to take the heat, right? Remember when he was at USC and they lost that game to Oregon, he jumped up in the stands and was crying to his mom. And look, I will be the last person to say that you shouldn't show your emotions or be emotional or show how, a loss can affect you. Like, absolutely. I think that we need to promote more of that. But when you're a quarterback and a leader of a team and you dodge post game questions in a really difficult loss because you're crying to your mom, like, that's not a good look at all for a leader in sports and in anything. And there were all of the reports that came out about, Caleb Williams didn't want to go to Chicago. He rather would have gone to the XFL than gone to Chicago. Like, all of these things about maybe Caleb Williams being tied in a silk bassinet and not really being able to be thrown into the fire, whether it's on the field or if it's in a press conference or it's the criticism on social media. Like, I understand that Caleb Williams' generation is different. They pay attention to what is said about them on the internet. They get hurt by bullies on the internet, but this is the NFL. And if you can't take that criticism in order to get better and get live game looks, then how long can you really be a starting quarterback in the NFL?
I guess the counter to that, though, is, and again, I feel like I'm arguing a point that isn't even mine, but the counter would be you got to know your quarterback. You got to know your players, right?
Yeah.
So if you happen to have a quarterback that is sensitive and, does seem to pay attention to those things, I've been in locker rooms where things I've said on radio or TV have come back and players have walked up to me and been like, I didn't appreciate this. And my first thought has always been, man, don't you have better things to do than listen to my radio show in the middle of the day? Like, it's just sort of
Right.
surprises me, right? But I think that's what we start to realize is that some people, it does hit different. And I'll say loud and proud, like I often credit Dan Orlovsky, my buddy, for being able, you could say whatever you want on social media to Dan. I've actually texted Dan before and been like, hey, saw what people are saying today. I'm really sorry you're dealing with that today. And he comes back and he's like, yeah, I don't care. Like, Dan is like that. He just doesn't care.
Yeah.
I can look at that comment and just be, it will sit in my head for 2 days. That's why I'm not a professional athlete. I'll sit there and be like, why are they being so mean? Like, I think that everybody's wired a little differently. I don't know Caleb, but it's up to the coaching staff to know him. So I think the concept of protecting him emotionally is not one I necessarily agree with, but I think the argument makes sense. I can stack the logic bricks together, given the fact that, like you said, he is known as a more sensitive type, and there is no grace. I was stunned, absolutely stunned to see bad throws from practice just all over the place on Twitter as some indication that Caleb Williams is an incompetent quarterback. Like, does his film at USC not matter at all to anybody anymore? But that's the society we're in. We would rather break down one bad day of practice throwing at a target than we would actually sit there and watch some of the film that he has and say, hey, yeah, there's some issues that they're going to coach through, but he was the number one pick for a reason.
But also, like, none of those things matter. And when you are a quarterback in the NFL, you are going to be on the highest of highs. And you are probably going to be pretty close to the lowest of lows. You're going to have some pretty low lows. That is just life in the National Football League. So it doesn't matter if you're in year 2 or in year 22. Those things are going to come at you. And I'll use my example in our careers, right? We put our opinions in public for a living. Like, that's a pretty vulnerable place to be. Obviously, we're not starting quarterbacks in the NFL, but I remember starting off in my career, had horrific takes and said incorrect information and got absolutely ripped apart and torn apart on social media. That was humbling and that was scary. And there were so many times where I thought, I just don't feel like being made fun of today. I don't feel like reading mean things about me today. And somebody that is very important to me and a mentor to me said, what, are you going to step away from it? What, are you going to be scared of it? Because the only way that you're going to get better is by continuing to show up in front of the microphone and continue to share your opinions and create calluses and get better. You don't get better by being scared of what people might say about you. Again, that's being a radio show host and a talk show host, not a quarterback in the NFL. But how is Caleb Williams supposed to get better if he isn't putting himself out there and actually doing it?
I agree with that. And I think I think a lot of this realistically, reasonably will calm down this weekend. I think when
Yeah,
Caleb comes out and has a competent control of a very vanilla game plan against a very vanilla defense because it's preseason, we'll all look at it and take a collective sigh of relief. And I also think that it's okay to admit that it's going to take a minute in this season. The concept that Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams wake up tomorrow and suddenly they are as dynamic as Jared Goff and Ben Johnson have been for the last several years, I think is a failed one. Jared Goff has spent a lot of time in this league, and Ben Johnson spent a lot of time working with him. Over time, can they be as successful? Heck yeah. And do I believe the Bears have
totally.
a real opportunity to be good? Yes. Do I think that has to be reflected in week 4 against the Raiders? No, I don't. And I'm not going to judge them harshly early on in the season if they have growing pains.